If we look back at the history of quest narratives and at the most innovative quest games, there's a set of traits that would seem to characterize the most well-designed quest spaces. And those traits are that the spaces should be labyrinthine, they should encode meaning in their layout, they should convey a sense of challenges that players need to overcome, and they should also convey a sense of progression so players know that they're getting somewhere. And if we put all of those virtues together, players ought to be able to sort of shape, change, and interact with that meaning that is encoded in the space. One of the characteristics of well-designed quest spaces is that they are labyrinthine. They are like a maze. And mazes have this long tradition of operating in games and narratives, and one of the things that they do is they're incredibly evocative. They're incredibly suggestive and symbolic. There's this long tradition of literary representations and artistic representations of labyrinths and mazes. And usually what they represent is this sort of human attempt to find one's own path, particularly when one becomes separated from society or sort of lost in the difficulties of life. So, there's a big Christian tradition. There are lots of emblem books from the Renaissance and the Middle Ages where these pictures representing the soul trying to find its way to salvation. When Joseph Campbell talks about the hero with 1,000 faces, he says that whenever the hero separates himself or herself from the rest of society and goes off on this journey, she will very soon find herself in a labyrinth, the abyss of her own soul and the abyss of all these issues that sort of rise up and all these complications and choices that rise up from being separate from one's society and going off on this journey. And that kind of leads into a big important trait, which is the idea that spaces can encode meaning. A lot of the classic medieval and Renaissance allegories communicate their ideas about virtue and spirituality and life through these symbolic mazes that people move through. So, the Bower of Bliss in Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene, or all the levels of hell, or the tiers on the mountain of purgatory that you have in the Divine Comedy. These spaces communicate meaning. They communicate ideas about the various virtues, the challenges of living a virtuous life, and also the vices that could distract from those virtues. So there's that tradition of representing meaning through these labyrinthine spaces, but the problem is it's pretty static in a narrative, and the way that a character interacts with those spaces is nevertheless sort of predetermined and linear for us as readers. So all he can really do is follow the Knight of Temperance as he walks around the Bower of Bliss, and he will always take the same path. And there's nothing really that we need to do as readers to accomplish that quest except read along, and the character will automatically be guaranteed to move through the space. And so what we sort of move toward when we start designing games is spaces in which we can interact with those meanings. Once we introduce the interactivity of games, we have to start thinking about gameplay traits that are going to make these spaces more involving, more fun, more interesting for players to explore. And so one of the things that makes games fun, and specifically quest games fun, is that there are these difficulties that players overcome through skillful gameplay. And when they overcome those difficulties, they're rewarded. So they get this sense of accomplishment and excitement that comes from that. And so the spaces themselves need to convey that sense of challenge. One way to do that is to look back at this whole literary and artistic tradition of mazes. So when we're dealing with games, we definitely do not want one of those linear pathways, those winding labyrinths. We want something that's challenging on the level of navigation. You can say that even moving through the space is challenging because you have to pick your path through it. You have to find your way to the various goals that you have. You can also have challenges that have to do with the movement through space upward or downward. Your goal is somewhere way up at the top of a tower or a castle, and so you have to fight your way toward it, clearing the monsters out and moving up through the levels of the castle. Or alternately, your goal is at the bottom of a deep, dark dungeon, And you know that the farther downward you go, the bigger and badder the monsters are going to be, the more risk you have that your party is going to be destroyed. But you also know that you're getting closer to your goal. So the movement upward and downward, which we have kind of colloquial in our speech when we say that we're moving toward a higher goal, or when role players say that they're leveling up, referring to the achievement of their characters, there's this very natural association of upward and downward movement with progression that we can really draw on. This is a place where literary models like, John Milton saying that long and hard is the way that leads out of hell up into light. That struggle that questers have had has long been kind of expressed through spatial movement. Now that we've introduced the issue of interactivity, players can feel that struggle. Trying to get up a mountain in Oblivion is almost like a process of physical exertion where you're pushing that joystick and you can almost sweat a little bit because you're trying to move upward. And so interactivity brings with it this sort of experiential virtue of being very close to that sense of challenge that comes from moving upward or downward, and also the sense of progression that comes through from it. So tiered and leveled spaces like the floors of a dungeon, or like a Mayan ziggurat, with a pyramid with all of these different levels to it. Those sorts of spaces are really good for conveying a sense of challenge. But what they're also really good for is conveying a sense of progression, because we don't want players to feel as if they're stuck in their quest, or that they're just lost and they don't know where their quests are supposed to be leading them. If we're really skillful, we can think about ways to encode the meanings that we've been talking about through that upward or downward movement. So the Oblivion Towers in the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion have this naming system by which you know that a higher level in the tower will have a more evil name. So the corridors of Dark Salvation are more evil than the halls of Bloodrending. And once you've figured that out, you've figured something out about the inverted, twisted, hellish value system of the plane of Oblivion. The meaning that's encoded in those spaces, which sound a whole lot like Piers Plowman or the Divine Comedy, they sound like the names that you would get in a medieval or Renaissance allegory. That meaning is being used as sort of a way to gauge progression and signify the increase of challenge. What could be even better is the opportunity that players would have not only to uncover the meanings in these spaces through their interactions, but to change them through their choices, to experience different meanings and different interpretations of a game through what they do as players. That could be as simple as two forks in a maze, one of which leads to love and the other of which leads to riches. And that's actually been used in kind of a retro indie game very recently called Passage, in which the different passages represent those possibilities in life. With this generation of tool sets, the spaces can actually morph and shift depending on the choices that you've made as a player and the inclinations that you have emotionally, psychologically. That's kind of the way of the future. If we put all of those virtues together, we can think about these labyrinthine, challenging, progressive spaces that not only encode meaning, but allow players to shape that meaning. What this sort of opens up is the possibility of making something like the planes in Dungeons & Dragons, where we have a multiverse that is supposed to respond very directly to belief and imagination, the belief and imagination of players and characters. And so, whereas when people were making Planescape Torment, that engine, the Infinity engine, really didn't allow them to make those spaces shift, now we can. And that opens up all kinds of new possibilities where branching narratives don't just have to happen in dialogue trees, which is the sort of accepted way of doing that. They can actually happen in the physical spaces in these very surreal, involving, interesting ways. So, once those possibilities open up, all kinds of new pathways in the labyrinth of level design also open up, and I think that's really exciting.